Hello and good evening from the old fire station in Oxford. I'm Craig Bennett, I'm Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you joining us for the first Wildlife Trust Wildlife for 2025. And why are we in Oxford? Well, of course, this first week of the year, every year, is when you have the combination of the Oxford Farming Conference and the Oxford Real Farming Conference here in Oxford for the same few days in that first week. So lots of people from across the agricultural sector come here to Oxford for this first week of January to discuss everything to do with farming, and particularly in recent years about sustainable agriculture in particular. We're here as the Wildlife Trust hosting this event in a space where people can come to it from the public, from members of the Oxford Farming Conference, which is the conference that's been running for years that you might think is more sort of mainstream farming, and the Oxford Real Farming Conference as well, which started out as sort of an alternative, but has really, really gained traction in the last decade or so, looking at more sustainable approaches to farming as well. And tonight we've got a cracking topic that we've got to discuss. We're asking the questions, are our farms future-proof? This is a really timely, important discussion. Just think about in the last 2-3 years alone, we've seen our farms often in summer suffering from very long-term droughts and not having enough water on the land, to in winter actually huge appalling flooding on our farms as well. And of course, this is to be expected. It was predicted long ago that climate change would result in these more extreme weather events and cause real challenges for farming. And we're seeing that occurring now. So the big question, are our farms future-proof? That's what we're asking tonight. We've got a fantastic panel to help us navigate that issue. We've got Debbie Wilkins, who's a nature-friendly farmer. We've got Tim Coates, who's Chief Investment Officer at Great Yellow. He'll tell us a bit more about that later. He's also a farmer. And we've got Pete Falloon, who's Scientific Lead for Food Security at the Met Office. And we've got a brilliant audience here live in Oxford. So I'd ask them to please give a warm welcome to our panel. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off just ask a few kind of warm-up questions, if you like, to our panel, so you all get to know them and understand where they're coming from tonight. But then we're going to go to a Q&A, where I have questions from the live audience here in Oxford and also questions from you at home online. So be ready to put your questions, put them in the questions in the chat on YouTube or whatever social media channel you're following, and we'll select them, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can tonight. So, Debbie, I'll start with you. You're a farmer. Tell us where you're a farmer, what kind of farming you do.
So, I've got a mixed farm in Gloucestershire in the Severn Vale, near the River Severn, sometimes very near the River Severn. It comes to meet me. I've had dairy cows, beef, and some arable.
And have you always been a farmer?
No, I came back to the farm about 16 years ago. Before that...
so it's back to the farm. It was a family farm, wasn't it?
Sorry, it's a family farm that my grandfather moved to in 1936, and my father farmed there all his life. He was a very nature-friendly farmer, and he farmed in a kind of traditional mixed farm way. I went away to university and did chemistry, and then went and worked for Unilever doing research in science, in proteins and stuff, and then came back 16 years ago and started farming and bringing kind of my scientific, not so much knowledge, but more kind of way of thinking, and having not been trained in agriculture, grown up on a farm and knew how the farm worked, but not have gone to agricultural college or anything like that. I think I looked at it a slightly different way and got very interested in the soil food web, and kind of took my father's traditional mixed farm, nature-friendly farming, and started to add regenerative principles into it.
Very interesting. So you've gone from sort of growing up on a family farm, then going to university, then working for one of this massive food companies around the world, to now back to the family farm itself.
Yeah. And it's a place I love, and it's always home, if you see what I mean. So I was always going back home.
And when you talk about regenerative agricultural principles, what do you mean by that? Because in this conversation about regenerative agriculture, lots of people have slightly different answers to that.
There's lots of different ways. For me, it probably starts with the soil, and if you get the soil right and the soil is alive, then that will support everything else that you're doing. But it's for me, it's not just regenerating the soil, but it's also the ecosystem services you've got there, whether that's the water or the air, and also the wildlife and the biodiversity, and people as well. You know, if you went back to farms, say 200 years ago, everybody in the village would know what was going on the farm and interact with it, and people would be much closer to what was happening. Now, people might live in a village with a farm, but they don't know what's going on. And I think part of the kind of regeneration is bringing people back in contact with where their food comes from and what farming's about.
Lovely. So regenerating the soil, but also regenerating the connection between the farm, between nature and people as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, fantastic. You were saying before that on your farm you felt those effects of being very close to the Severn.
Yes.
And you know, tonight we're talking about the impacts of climate change on farming. Tell us a little bit more. What are the impacts you've seen?
Well, we have big floods when Wales gets a lot of rain, and it comes down.
Yeah, blame Wales, I would.
Yeah, we blame Wales. It comes down through Shropshire and Worcestershire and ends up on our meadows, and they're floodplain meadows, and you know they have for centuries, probably millennium, always flooded, and they were prized before fertiliser for being fertile. You know, they were the places that people wanted to farm because they had that natural fertility from the flooding. But the big floods, as a kid, I probably remember them every 5-6 years. We'd have a big flood. Last year, I think we had 7 peaks, and it started in October and finished in April. This winter, we've already on our third flood.
Really?
So my aim is just to be more resilient to that. So rather than planting wheat or something that won't cope with being flooded, I have permanent pasture that can cope. And some of those meadows have species rich and species that can cope with flooding and come back. They still suffer a bit from that flooding, but they bounce back. And so you don't need to have to reseed them or do anything. You leave them and they'll come back. So it's trying to be resilient to what's coming down the line. Yeah,
because it's interesting, isn't it? Of course, in historical times, flooding was in many respects seen how you regenerated the soil. You had silt sort of dumped on it. It gave more nutrients and fertiliser essentially to the soil.
Yeah, so in our meadows, after a big flood, you get a layer of silt. You know, that brown water that used to be running off fields upstream. Some of that silt ends up on my fields and adds to the fertility of it.
Oh, there you are. You can thank Wales for that.
I can thank Wales for that. I've got gaining some of their soil. And lots of it goes out into the ocean, which you don't particularly want it to do. But you've got to farm with nature and what's happening. But I think we're getting, anecdotally more floods, and they seem to come quicker and be bigger.
Yeah. Well, we'll hear from Pete in a bit.
Yeah, he can tell us about that.
Go beyond the anecdotes to the science on this. But so tell us more then about making your farm resilient to these kind of extreme weather events. You've got your sense of where you're trying to go with that. But I mean, what more could be done? And what's your general sense really as to the kind of the support that's needed particularly from government perhaps to help maybe your farm, but farming generally in Britain become more resilient to climate events? Well,
I think going the right way with the ELMs and the sustainable farming incentives.
ELMs are the environmental land management schemes.
Yes,
the new agricultural schemes that have been introduced post Brexit. Yeah,
and it's just the time it's taking to happen. So this time last year at the Oxford conference, they announced a new higher level thing for floodplain meadows, but I've got floodplain meadows and they're still not in that scheme, and now they've recently announced that they're going to start releasing them, and they've started doing the data, and it might be able to apply in the summer, and I might get this time next year some payment, so it could be 2 years.
So you mean the practical deliveries, that you get the big announcements, but actually the practical delivery from Whitehall is delayed?
Yeah, and you can't plan what you're going to do as a farmer if you think, well, sometime it'd be great to be in that scheme and to do that, but you don't know when it's going to be released or when you can get into it. So I think it's great that we've got these schemes and that support, but it's kind of getting it practically on the ground.
There's an issue. I've had people from the Nature Friendly Farming Network have said to me before that actually this particularly can hit nature friendly farming because of the need. If nature friendly farming say moves to 7-year rotations. You need that long-term certainty of the schemes to be able to do the planning.
Yeah, no, you definitely need that certainty to know what you're doing and to plan. I've got 40 kilometres of hedges and I want to lay and rejuvenate them and coppice them to keep them working well. But I need to plan. I can't do all of those in 1 year, and I need to plan. But if I don't know that I'm going to get support doing that, it might not happen.
Yeah. And Debbie, final question from me. What do you see in all this context? There's been a bit of discussion here at these Oxford conferences the last few years about the future of profitability of farms, but also the future of productivity. And they're not necessarily the same, are they?
No, definitely not.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit, how do you see that playing out, the difference between profitability and productivity?
I think, you have to be profitable.
Yeah, of course.
If you're not profitable, what's the saying? If you're in the red, you can't be green. But lots of people are thinking, I want that many tons of wheat per acre, or that many kilos of milk from a cow. But if you've got to put the inputs in there to push the system,
inputs like fertilizers,
feed,
yeah,
you're pushing it beyond breaking point, and it's for me. I've tried to be more resilient. I'm not pushing the system as hard. I don't put the fertilizer on. I don't push the animals as hard to grow faster or produce more milk, to give that resilience. And so, I think, you need to be profitable, but productive. You need to produce food. As a farmer,
of course,
I want to produce food, and that's my job. But I don't want to do it at the expense of the environment and of the farm.
Yeah. And there's a lot of research now shows that perhaps producing a bit less and reducing those inputs can be more profitable.
Yeah, and hopefully it's more nutrient dense. So if what we produce is better for people to eat or animals to eat, then actually producing less, you're still getting that same amount of nutrients from the land.
Great, good. Well, Debbie, thank you very much. That sounds fantastic. You like producing the food. I can assure you I like eating it. And I probably did a bit too much of that over the last few weeks. Anyway, but thank you very much. Tim, let me come to you. You're director of, you're Chief Investment Officer at Great Yellow. Tell us what that is.
So thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Great Yellow is a new advisory firm that's been set up to answer a really wicked question, which is, how do we get 100 billion deployed to nature recovery in 5 years?
Excellent.
Which is to meet the 30 by 30 targets that we want to achieve globally. But and as an aside, Great Yellow is named after the Great Yellow Bumblebee, which if we don't achieve that, won't be here in the UK anymore, which is only hanging on very much when it used to be actually a species across the whole country.
You're wearing a little bumblebee.
I'm wearing a little one.
Badge.
Thank you to the Bumblebee Trust for that.
Yeah.
So it's a wicked problem. It's a huge challenge that we face globally, but also particularly in the UK, as we know we're incredibly nature depleted here, and clearly farms have a specific context in that. So again, I think it's now well known that 70% of UK land is farmland. It's farmed in some way. So what's the role of the farm in that kind of context? How do we treat farms as specific ecosystems? And on Farm Myself, that's the mantra I kind of have. What is the farm as an ecosystem? And as sort of just as Debbie was saying, like, what do we want out of a farm? What is the role of a farm? Well, it is hopefully to produce healthy, nutritious food. But there's a whole other range of ecosystem services. Food is an ecosystem service, which need and can be produced from farm. I think the challenge we've really got is I wouldn't start from here. I mean, what a great system we have. A food system where the primary producer is broke and the final consumer is ill.
Yeah.
We've done really well as a society to achieve that outcome.
And so who is doing well out of that?
Oh, there's always people doing well out of every system, right? And the status quo is, wants to say, and that's what's... We're in Oxford, which is where I'm originally from. I was born in the great John Radcliffe Hospital. And that's why we have an OFC and an RFC, I think, because there are people who think there are different people winning from the status quo, and maybe there needs to be a shift. But actually that big shift is the ecosystem of support around farmers needs to change. So there needs to be new sets of people who may not have engaged with agriculture engaging with it, but actually those who already do, everyone from professional services, so lawyers, accountants, land agents particularly, that group who have done, but then banks, insurers, others, etc., need to actually think about what their engagement is with farming. Debbie mentioned community. I think that's also incredibly important. Like, how do we, as farmers, engage with our communities, re-engage with our communities, but how do the communities also learn how to engage with farms? Because actually we're all in this together.
Tell us a little bit more about your farm.
So I farm in Oxfordshire. I'm in northwest Oxfordshire. About 500 hectares, mixed farm, predominantly arable, but with just over 1,000 head of sheep, a few turkeys for Christmas, and 20 Oxford and Sandy black rare breed pigs. So my story is not too dissimilar to Debbie's, really, although it's a bit shorter. I've only came back to farm 8 years ago, having grown up there when it was also a mixed farm, but quite different, and it went through quite a transition in the previous generation, driven by economic forces, I would say. And my I've been going through what I would call a regenerative transition quite aggressively over those past 8 years, and that involved, there were no livestock when it became my privilege and problem. There are now, and that's a huge part of how I've managed to achieve the things I want to achieve in terms of farming better for nature, but also, nothing that was being produced 8 years ago was going directly to human consumption, and it took me 7 years to get to everything going back to directly to human consumption.
Really? Why so long, would you say?
The market opportunities,
right.
Actually, and to balance the books along the way,
right,
and to manage that risk of transition. These are not straightforward things. So
it was, just to be very specific about this, it was more profitable to produce what rather than what?
So was it more profitable? I'm not sure it was, actually, but right. It seemed to be more profitable a decade ago to be producing commodity feed crops.
Right.
So feed wheat, feed barley, also off they would go, to find the way into either, to various animal feeds. Right. Yeah. Which is, really the other side of destruction, actually. It's not a great system. It's very inefficient, if you think about it. It doesn't seem inefficient to everyone globally, but it is at an individual farm level. Whereas now, I've worked out how we can actually, grow varieties, so milling wheat varieties, so that are going directly to be milled for, flour. The barley's a problem because, I'm not sure, whether we really need more beer and whiskey, but, I like it. But, is that a priority? I'm not sure. Will it be a priority in the future? Are farms future-proof? Really, is that the crop we want to be growing when we may have very challenging circumstances in the coming decades? Don't know. But and livestock obviously is much more straightforward. And actually, a lot of my ground was being farmed as arable when that's not what it wants to be. It wants to be pasture. It wants to be woodland. And most of my pleasure of the past 8 years has been the 30,000 trees we planted. Right. In various ways, both in hedgerows and in deliberate plantations, and a whole range of species and climate forward species, but fruit and nuts as well. So which will hopefully be the ones that give the real reward in the future.
Fantastic. So I asked Debbie before about what more is needed from government to support this transition to help farmers make their farms more resilient to changing weather. But what would you say? You were talking there about the food system more broadly. I asked you who's really won in this. What would you say is needed from retailers and other people in the supply chain in particular? What's needed from them to enable farmers to become more resilient to changing weather?
Well, I think I'll first answer by saying what we're not going to get. We're not going to get price increases. So the consumer can't tolerate price increases for a whole range of economic reasons. Let alone before retailers get into their profit margins and whether they want to give those up or not. But what is needed is investment in the regenerative transition at scale and fast. And that's actually a massive challenge at the moment. There's lots of good PR out there. I've heard a nice phrase, someone else's word, which is pilot washing, which is, look, we're doing this great thing. And they are great, but they're pilots, they're small, and do they scale? And that's a big question. And that's, part of what we want to do at Great Yellow is support that question, which is how do we scale those good solutions? But that's what we need. It's the supply chain that needs to go, actually, we are at risk. We're not resilient. Look at, I think it's becoming again well publicised, the coffee supply chain, the cocoa supply chain, olive oil supply chain are starting now to collapse. right? Well, actually, in the last 2 harvests that we've just recently had, the last 2 years, there has not been enough wheat grown in the UK to supply the amount we need to mill flour for bread in the UK, so we're importing it. So that's not good for food security long term, and we could get more and more scenarios like that. So retailers, food manufacturers, they've got the resiliency problem as well. If they want to do something about resilience, they need to invest in the primary producer. They need to invest in a regenerative system.
Absolutely. Great. Well, Tim, thank you very much. Really useful and interesting to hear about that, hear about your work. Let's go on to our next guest. So Pete Falloon, who's scientific lead for food security at the Met Office. Pete, lots of people everyone will really have heard of the Met Office and be very familiar with the weather forecast that the Met Office produces. Many, I'm sure in this audience as well, will be familiar with the work that the Met Office does around climate science. People are probably less familiar about the fact that there's a food security programme at the Met Office.
Yeah, absolutely. I won't talk about this bit too much, but there's a lot of international facing work on sort of development in the global south as well, and providing information and services and capability there. But largely what I've been leading and working on over the last 10 years or so is work for DEFRA, really, where we're taking climate science and the fundamental knowledge of the changes in weather, rainfall, temperature and so on, translating that to provide evidence, scientific evidence to support adaptation policy and resilience, particularly things like the work of the Climate Change Committee and the Climate Change Risk Assessment. So you might not all be familiar with this, but embedded in UK policy and parliamentary requirements as part of the of adaptation policy under the Climate Change Act. Every 5 years, the government and the scientific community produce a risk assessment looking at climate change. So we're actually now in the 4th 5-yearly cycle of that process. And that looks across all different sectors of the economy, including the international dimensions. There's an independent scientific report which is produced by the scientists and overseen by the Climate Change Committee, the independent climate body, which then informs the government's own risk assessment. And as part of that 5-yearly cycle as well, there is also something called the National Adaptation Programme, which sets out the actions government will take to ensure resilience to climate change across the different sector, who owns those actions, what needs to be done, and there's also monitoring of how well that works and so on. So those are sort of the kinds of things we're contributing to, as well as something you might have heard of more recently, the UK Food Security Report.
Yeah, so this came out just last year, 2024. Yeah. What does it say?
Yeah, well, just to introduce where that's come from, I think this is the kind of second recent edition, really. There was one back in 2021, and again, it's required now at least every 3 years to be updated under Act of Parliament. There was one that was about 10 or so years ago in a similar vein. And so it looks at quite a broad array of sets of information on the food system, all the way from sort of global food production, UK food supply chains, household, food safety, those sorts of dimensions. There are 5 main streams of information. Really what it's trying to do is look at official government statistics and data that we have and trends. We've been working with DEFRA very closely, particularly in the last few years, and we'll continue doing that to bring in climate change thinking, both in terms of what's happened already, but also in terms of what's likely to come in the future, because we think actually, although it's not a policy document, it's saying what has happened, it's really important to bring out where we think things are going, so that can inform policy and hopefully awareness and action. Right,
great. Now, this food security report last year, and actually previous food security reports, commissioned by DEFRA and so on, what they've shown for a long time is obviously the big threat that both climate change and biodiversity loss poses to food security.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that, I think that the information we've been working with others to provide into that has grown, really. So back in 2021, There was a relatively sort of brief section on climate change impacts. In the most recent version, you'll probably find climate change information embedded throughout that document where we felt it was appropriate, and sort of everywhere from marine science and oceans to the land as well. And absolutely it's recognising events and things that have happened and their increasing impact, but also drawing on the work of the international science community as well as the work we do in the Met Office in terms of the future risks. But certainly, you know, it's helped raise awareness of those changing risks into the future.
And Pete, we've already heard from Debbie and from Tim their own experience of some of the impacts of climate change on their farms. But paint us a picture more generally. What are the impacts we're already seeing on farms across the UK?
Yeah, I think, you know, as you said at the beginning, Craig, really actually many of the impacts we're seeing, not all of them, because we can't what we call attribute everything to climate change without sort of formal statistical analysis and so on. But many of the patterns we're seeing do fall in line with what we expect from a warming climate. And I think as well as the climate getting warmer and seeing longer term seasonal patterns like warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers, the thing that's really having the big impact are these extreme events which we expect to increase in a changing climate, whether it's high temperatures, very high temperatures and heat waves, whether it's periods of low rainfall and drought or heavy rainfall, you know, thinking mostly about the land aside from things like sea level rise and storm surge. The reason the rainfall events change in that way particularly is really because a warmer climate can hold more moisture. So when it rains, it tends to come in bigger, heavier downpours, and then you get longer periods of low rainfall and drought in between. So, you know, as you said at the beginning, we saw the wettest 18 months on record and really significant areas of productive farmland flooded. In 2022, the heat wave also had impacts on poultry production and all the way through to retail. Actually, there were fairly significant failures in refrigeration in retail facilities as well. So we are seeing these events having impact. And it's probably worth also, I guess, thinking about separating the two, because we mainly work on the weather hazard, so the weather event. But, you know, for that to matter, to make a difference, it has to impact somewhere where something matters and it's vulnerable, which, you know, in some of these cases we're now seeing.
Okay, well, Pete, thank you very much. That gives us a good picture to set the scene here. Do bring in your comments and questions live on YouTube, and we'll try and get to as many as we can tonight. But we also have a wonderful in-person audience here in Oxford. So I'm going to start with the audience here. See if there's anyone who wants to put a question to our panel right now. Yes, we have a lady at the front here, please. Just wait for the microphone to come to you. And please just give us your name. Tell us who you are.
I'm Tracy from the Rare Breed Survival Trust. It's mainly for Debbie and Tim. I was interested in how you feel the choice of livestock breed plays into the resilience of your farm, and also, do you feel that farmers and the wider public view native breed livestock as part of the farm's biodiversity?
I hadn't really thought about the native breeds being part of biodiversity. That's quite interesting to think about. But I do think thinking about the breeds rather than those extremes that are bred just for production. So, you say with your dairy cows, you know, the extreme Holstein Friesian that produces very large amount of milk, but isn't really capable of grazing efficiently and needs to be fed and probably housed to do that. So for me, to be more resilient, having an animal that can graze and get its own food out in the field rather than it being brought to it and then you having to remove the muck and taking it away, you know, those are all things that affect, you know, your inputs from your farm and how resilient you can be. And maybe how well they grow as well. So like some of the kind of more native breeds can grow better on just grass. You know, they're more hardy. You know, we've got the hardy cow behind us who can cope with being out on moorland and things like that and still grow. Whereas if you put put some of these kind of highly strung breeds, they wouldn't cope with that. I suppose the chicken is probably the best example of that, because the chickens that are commercially grown are not the ones that would cluck around a farmyard any longer, and maybe moving back towards a kind of slower breeding, slower growing animal would be better.
Tim?
Yeah, some similar thoughts. So our sheep flock is on a New Zealand Romney base, which is not a rare breed, but is chosen for its hardiness, right? And again, it's about its ability to be outdoors consistently, able to live off the forage of the land, as it were, of the pasture. And we run an integrated system, so they actually are part of our rotational arable grazing. So most of them at the moment are on cover crops over winter, and we manage that on at least every other day movement. But we are experimenting with breeding in some other traits, because we're also, this is a future-proofing thinking. We're trying to think, well, what other traits might we like to try and bring in to that kind of hardiness? So we've had some interesting experiments, sort of breeding in some Clin, some Lecloon, because we kind of think, well, is there an ability to also have a multi-purpose sheep? At the moment, we're in a meat pathway world. Wool is worth, well, nothing. I think that's quite famous. I mean, this is unfortunately not UK. This is the great Icelandic wool, which is a luxury passion of mine, because I'm like that. But we're looking at whether we can get a sheep that can be milked, which isn't a purpose dairy sheep, which again has no hardiness, has gone down a genetic pathway that probably is a cul-de-sac, frankly. We have Oxford Sandhian Blacks, which are a rare breed. And that's not just because they're really cute, but we use them again as ecosystem engineers. So they are both pastured and panned is the approach we take. So they come in, we don't breed them. We're coming as weaners, and we grow them up to a point where they again can go and turn over particular arable parcels that might need that kind of recovery treatment, and then they go and live off the rest of their lives before the inevitable in the woodland. Which they very much enjoy, and is again very good for that woodland in terms of management of that. So it's a combined system is what we're trying to do.
Great question, Tracy. And one of the things I love about doing wildlife here in Oxford at this time of year is we do have great experts in the audience. So, Tracy, since you are from the Rare Breed Survival Trust, our friends there, just give us a sentence or two about the ability of rare breeds to do exactly what you were saying in the questions.
Well, I mean, that, pretty much what you've said there, the rare native breeds were developed or, have grown over centuries in some cases to the local environments, to our weather. They are resilient to not have as many inputs, so they are better adapted to grazing on grass full time. They're better at outwintering, generally less veterinary inputs. As you say on the picture behind you, it's not your sort of dairy sward of perfect grass. They are, better at finding some sort of nutrients out of different habitats. So generally, if you're going a more regenerative route, then native breeds are going to be, I think, becoming more at the forefront. And as Tim said about breeding, to keep those genetic resources there for future, so that if we have got very single use, it's either meat or dairy or wool or whatever it was. Now I think the move back towards more dual purpose will help with resilience.
Okay, Tracy, thank you very much. And I think from the Wildlife Trust, we'd say as often these sort of older breeds as well that have evolved here in the British Isles over many years, typically they're much closer as a proxy to the sort of wild ancestors they would have been as well. Highland cows are much closer, say, to aurochs that would have existed here before humans came to the British Isles, and so do a better job for wildlife as well as being more resilient. Really good question, thank you. I've got some great comments coming in from YouTube. There's this question, which I think we can just treat as a rhetorical question. I don't think you can answer if you feel like it, but are DEFRA and NFU truly aware of farming's contribution to biodiversity loss and the climate crisis, or is economic growth more important? Question mark. You can answer if you want, but I'll just leave that hanging there. Good question here from Chris. Can small arable farms be made climate resilient, wildlife friendly, and still be profitable, or must they be a critical size to fulfil those aims? Interesting question. Pete, would you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I'll have a first stab at it. And also, actually, I think the discussions about resilience just now were really interesting too.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I will mention is heat stress is one of the things we've done some work on for the future, which I think is a really critical one for livestock. Equally, in a similar way, there's been some really interesting work with big seed bank collections for wheat in particular, and looking at the genetics of that and realising a much broader range of traits than the conventional varieties. There's some really fascinating science I was reading about with that before. But in terms of smaller farms, so that's a really difficult question, because one of the things you might say, one of the things I do have to say is, we know about trends and patterns in climate change. On longer timescales, we can't be certain exactly what's going to happen in the sense of it's not forecasting like we do for weather, where we could give really, detailed levels of confidence. So in the face of that uncertainty, one of the things you might do is hedging, and you might, plant some drought, say for example, drought or heat tolerant crops, and some more standard ones, because I suspect as it stands, more resilient crops may be less productive under average conditions, but have better response to, these severe and extreme events. So I would imagine that, that might become a bit more challenging with smaller farms, but I don't know. It'd be good to hear from folks who actually
do
the work on.
Yeah, I think, it is harder with the smaller farms. A lot of things are mechanised now. You haven't got a labour force there to be able to do the jobs that when you had a small farm before. So, and machinery costs a lot of money. So, I think maybe you might be able to have small arable farms, but they might have to be in kind of collaboration groups so that they work together with other people to spread those costs. And maybe you shouldn't just have arable farms. Maybe all farms should be mixed farms. Yeah.
Which would have been the case once upon a time. Yeah. Tim?
Yeah, I was going to say something like that. I mean, it's a unit economics thing. And I'm 500 hectares, and I often think that's kind of, again, 20 years ago, that probably would have been sort of in the smaller range at the end, but of large. And now it's definitely in the kind of larger end of small. That trend has been happening anyway for a variety of economic reasons more than anything, and demographic change. And that's I think the forecasts on that particular question are that that's likely to continue. So there are I will do that thing where I mention something and say I'm not mentioning it, which is policy change might also drive that over the next few years as well, given recent changes in the budget. But so that trend may accelerate. I think that has some demographic and societal knock-ons, but from an environmental point of view, I'm with you, Debbie. I think, and that's why I've done it myself. I mean, mixed farming is more resilient, and it's also more resilient from a diversification point of view. It's not just about this crop might do well, this crop might do well. Actually, that livestock, that market might be different. The markets do. There's a bit of an old saying about. Generally, if you've got a bad, particularly if you're exposed to both sides of a bad arable harvest, well, that generally means that if you've got your own livestock and you might be you're hedged against that, right? So
yeah. Well, there's a reason we have the phrase "not all your eggs in one basket," I guess. So let's take another question from here in Oxford. Yeah, gentleman over there, and I see you, Kath, for next. Yeah.
Thanks, Craig. Chris Clark. I'd like to try and bring together the farm resilience and food security and make an observation first, which is 80% of farm businesses do not cover their variable and fixed costs before support. Is it possible to have a proper, successful food security policy when the inherent agricultural industry is bankrupt?
Tim, you were touching this before, so I'm going to come straight to you. And because you were frowning, so I thought that was fun.
Well, you'd like to think so. I think it doesn't feel like it, does it? And I guess that's, I think food security is a political question. It's not an agricultural one. And
what do you mean by that? That's a very interesting statement.
Yeah, because I think on a global scale, it's in the same way. It's just that something I personally don't. So I'll say quickly, I'm a member of the NFU, but something I don't agree on is the kind of mantra of it's the job of farmers to feed the world. I think feed the world is a really dangerous phrase. It is the job of political systems to be well organised and well governed to ensure that resources are well spread such that there isn't starvation and famine, which is completely achievable with the amount of global output that we have. It's a distribution and political problem, right? Yeah. So the job of a UK farmer is obviously to produce food and fibre and timber and a range of ecosystem services that support overall, societal outcomes. Can that be achieved without state support? Not today, but we've got to try and think of a system that would allow that to be possible.
Okay, thanks. Pete or Debbie, do you want to have a go at that one? Or?
I was going to kind of say not so much about the state support, but it's also kind of the kind of general way farmers are thought of. Kind of as a farmer, I kind of feel got at all the time, and that that I've caused climate change and that I'm destroying the environment when I don't think I have, and I'm trying to improve the environment and I'm trying to produce food, and I suppose that kind of mental health and that kind of, if you want farmers to be resilient and to produce food and support the environment, kind of feel like they need a bit of kind of support, and maybe not just financial. Financial is very important, but that kind of feeling like you're part of society and not just kind of always got at.
Pete, anything on this one?
Not particularly, but I mean, I guess just to recognise, I think government and industry are increasingly working together on this, and there's something I've been involved in a little called the Food and Drink Sector Council, which is bringing together representatives across government, not just DEFRA and farming and the industry, to talk about some of these issues. The meetings I went to were certainly quite frank, and there was a lot of listening, I think, on both sides, which I think is a really positive thing. And the thing that I think is clear, that there is a recognition of a need for an effective UK food security strategy, and a recognition, that there's need to improve and be more resilient in the face of the multiple threats and challenges that we face for the future, not just climate.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's take another from here in Oxford. I know Kath already had her hand up. Good, microphone's already there, good. And Kath, tell us who you are.
Kath Dalmeny from Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. I'm feeling quite moved by all of your presentations.
You just hold the mic a bit closer.
Feeling quite moved by all of your presentations, including by the fact that the Met Office is here. That's amazing. It feels like we're getting better and better at describing the problem, in a way. What I don't see is the policies and the finance that will support you wonderful people, you people who are making the transition to regenerative farming, to really help you. I don't want to see you as the villain. I don't at all. I think you're among friends. We would love to see everything thrown at helping good farmers do the right thing. I wonder what the panel think about. What are the policies you would really like to see, and fast, over the next few years?
Great. Now, look, we've got hundreds of people watching online and asking you questions. We've got lots of questions here. So if the panel's all right, what I'm going to do is capture loads of questions and comments online and from here, and then you can reply to whichever ones you want at the end, because I just want to get many more out. We have a question here from Jonathan online. Is further education doing enough to train future farmers, the skills and the knowledge that will be needed for the future? I think that's a cracking question. Question from Dustin. The prospect of climate tipping points, like the collapse of the North Atlantic subpolar GER, is rising rapidly. What would it take to ensure farmers and crop breeders are ready to abruptly adapt if a tipping point is passed? I think that's really interesting, because we talk at the moment about hotter summers and wetter winters, of course, but obviously there's a scenario here within a few decades, perhaps, where actually we could have much colder, wetter summers as well. So I'm definitely going to come to you on that, Pete. Any other questions here in the audience in Oxford? Yeah, lady here in the middle.
Hi there, I'm Jenna Hegarty from the Nature Friendly Farming Network. It's been really, I think, quite clear from the farmers on the panel talking that the changes that you've made to your farming systems have largely been in spite of rather than facilitated by policy and funding. But what I'm really interested in is what were the things that you saw on your farms that made you think I need to make some changes, and why? Because I think that journey on the kind of regenerative path is spurred by something, and I'd love to know what that something was for both of you.
Great, good one. I'm going to take another from online here. There's some great questions coming in. What are the thoughts about prioritising floodplains and developing an overall floodplain strategy, allowing for an alignment of different policies and financing, enabling floodplains to deliver significantly greater public goods? That's from Olivia. Key question there. There's also from Janet. There is currently an impression that large-scale industrial farm managers are oblivious or actively against the regeneration of farming practices in the UK. They seem to be the bad guys. Is there, in fact, evidence of a movement within larger farming businesses towards methods of improving biodiversity? Let's take one more from here in Oxford. Have we got one more from the audience? Yeah.
Hi, Richard Sanders. Mine's more for Pete, but if the other panellists have thought about this as well, it'd be interesting to hear whether there are sort of international examples that we can think about with a sort of changing climate. Is Devon the next south of France, or those sorts of things that can be useful for thinking about resilience going forward into the future. And then for the other panelists, have they looked at international examples and crops grown elsewhere, and what other people in currently warmer climates are doing, thinking about the future as well.
Okay, good. Look, I could ask questions to you guys all night, but let's hear your answers. Pete, can I come to you first, please? Certainly there's the one about the climate tipping points there, but quite a few other questions that you might want to pick up as well.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, really honoured that you said you were touched by this. I think I only said something to someone on LinkedIn the other day, a guy called Dominic Waters, who's a sort of a council estate campaigner in food. He'd elicited a similar reaction from a lord in his work in the House of Lords, and I said, well, if you aren't touching people, you won't be changing things, and I think it is what is needed. So that's great. In terms of policies and finance, some of the work we did, we work a lot in partnership in the work we're doing for DEFRA with ADAS, the consultancy. They did a little piece of work looking at the current agricultural policies and not measuring how effective they were actually being, but whether they were pointing in the right direction for adaptation. And I think it was reassuring that most of them, it was felt that they were, but actually I think it would be really good to have an assessment of how effective those might be in more detail, and anything we might need to do more to build resilience. And the other is the application within the Met Office is really applying climate science to government policy, and actually we need to apply that to farming, like we are here, having conversations about how to take that information into practice and into reality. The point about education is really interesting here too. I mean, actually in the Met Office, we're going through significant transformation in the AI sphere, where actually there's lots of, given the volumes of data and technology and computing and everything else, and I think technological is one thing, but equally the twin track of more regenerative practices in farming too. So yeah, I completely support that, and climate as well. The point about tipping points is a really challenging one. Over the last few years, I've been involved in quite a few government and international assessments that have looked at that a bit. It's not my particular area, but the potential issues range from things like more, at least at the extreme ends, more sort of almost like Dust Bowl like scenarios being looked at through, as you said, the slow down of the Atlantic meridional overturning current, or the Gulf Stream, as probably most of us know it, and significant changes in the direction of climate change, shall we say, for northern Europe. The loss of the Amazon forest, which could again disrupt global and local climate to a degree, but also things like societal tipping points and unrest. And actually some work's been done recently looking at food prices and food availability shocks and what that might mean in the UK. So there's lots of work looking at this. I think the harder thing is, what do you actually do practically from a policy perspective? Because the potential changes involved are quite uncertain often, not all, but generally more uncertain than the mainstream climate messages, and sometimes so large in impact that actually knowing how you would respond would be really hard. But there's lots of thinking going on, I think, across, particularly in government and between government and science, looking at some of these.
It means you've got a massive range of scenarios, essentially.
Yeah,
Potential.
Yeah, and all the way. The thing, there are lots of work in the Government Office for Science looking at what they call foresighting. For example, they lead on a lot of this sort of work. But yeah, it's lots of different scenarios, and at least trying to paint some of the potential pictures to see how we might think about responding. Floodplains are a really interesting one. I think we're lucky in Devon. We've got a really interesting project led by Clinton Devon Estates in the Lower Otter Valley, significant floodplain restoration projects. But of course, there are trade-offs, and there are, there's a huge biodiversity benefit. We've seen incredible numbers of birds and diversity coming into those new wetland areas, but of course some of it was productive farmland, so there are trade-offs there. I'm trying to think, there's a couple of others. There was one about large-scale farming being against regenerative. I'm not sure, but actually in the sense of, there are probably two things to mention here. In the sense of at least climate, some of the big food businesses and bigger operations are moving towards looking at climate risk assessments because of something called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which obliges big businesses to set out where their financial risks are and do something about it. There's a similar thing, the TNFD, which is basically nature disclosures as well. And I think some of these things are encouraging, shall we say, bigger businesses to start thinking about this. Finally, on the international examples, yes, we have looked to some extent at where I guess what we call analog climates, or where, what does the future climate of the UK look like parallel to regions that currently, say, grow wheat and so on. And actually, there's, for us into the future, I think largely it's probably worth also saying lots of Northern Europe, particularly for wheat and perhaps for some other crops, generally is likely to benefit relative to much of the rest of the world from some warming. But even in more extreme scenarios, there are areas that have that still grow crops, albeit different varieties of crops and in different ways. So we've looked at that a bit, and we're also looking at the other end of the scale at things like the climate hazards to Spain and fruit and vegetable production, that side of things. There's also some really good work by UKCEH, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, looking at taking climate scenarios and mapping over the UK suitability for a huge range of different crops. So yeah, there's lots of stuff in there. Be very happy to talk about that later.
Great. Pete, thank you so much for getting through many of those questions. Fantastic. Tim, which ones do you want to pick up on?
I'm going to canter through and tie it all together.
Go for it.
Do my best. I'll start with the larger farming businesses bit. And in a previous role, I was involved quite closely in setting up a new agricultural bank, which worked with some of the largest farming businesses in the country over the last sort of 6-7 years. And I think I don't think size is the determining factor about our approach to regenerative or approach to nature-friendly farming. And I also don't think there's any value in putting any form of division between types of farmers in a social sense. We're all in it together, large or small, and the food chain, all the way up to retail, and getting all that to work together is the clear thing that needs to happen, which therefore that's what the government should be trying to make happen. That's what they're there for. They're facilitators and regulators and conveners and governors. That's government. So if that needs to be through legislation, needs to be through regulation and regulatory bodies taking stronger action in certain places, then that would be great. You mentioned TCFD, TNFD, some of that's mandated onto certain companies already. It should be mandated everywhere, basically, TNFD in particular, as fast as possible, such that companies of reasonable size have to actually assess their impacts and dependencies on nature and take action to therefore realise they are not apart from nature but part of it, and invest in it. That would be very helpful, and the only government I think is going to force that to happen at pace. I think one thing that I'm involved in is the Landscape Recovery Programme, which is the largest part of the ELMS scheme, which is ours is very focused on flooding here in Oxfordshire, the Evenlode catchment. We're managing the 3 rivers of the Evenlode catchment, or we want to be managing the 3 rivers of the catchment, to restore those habitats, restore the paleochannels, restore the hydrology that would have been there before we started mucking about with it several hundred years ago, in order to do things about flood management, water quality, very big problem. The Joyous Thames Water are one of our counterparties, and stop Oxford flooding, give us clean water, provide water in drought situations, all of those kinds of things. So the government is facilitating something in spite of facilitated. I mean, the funny thing is I feel like some of the policy that's coming in now is catching up with what I was doing in my change, which is nice. So that's handy. And I do think there's a huge risk of various climate tipping points. That's what I'm trying to build. I'm building my, ark on land, my little oasis. If it all goes wrong, hopefully I've got a resilient pocket of the country. Because I don't want us to end up in highly predictable scenarios like what happened to Valencia, where complete landscape collapse has happened, small water cycles broken, and we lead to that kind of horrific outcome.
We haven't got too long left, I'm afraid.
I'll just say the final bit then. So what did I see and what made me change? Well, it's actually what I didn't see, what I didn't hear. One of the joys of going away and coming back is you suddenly you feel the change, and it was a felt change. You couldn't hear the life, couldn't see the life, and not on my watch. So something had to change.
Brilliant, thank you, Tim. And Debbie, which questions do you want to pick on?
I was going to say what really inspired me to be a nature-friendly farming.
Yeah, I think you're okay.
Yeah, was just it's the opposite probably. I saw the life on the farm, and I wanted it to stay there. I loved going down in the meadows, and if I hear a curlew, I get so excited, and seeing huge dragonflies down there, and when I came back to the farm, my father asked me, why didn't we have so many mushrooms in the meadows that we used to have? They used to be white with mushrooms in the autumn. And that started me on the journey looking at the soil food web. And when I looked down a microscope and I saw the life that's in the soil, it just blew my mind. When you think of a field with cows in it, there's as much weight of life under the soil as there is above the soil. And that, kind of realised that you've got to work with nature. It's such a complex thing. You can't try and fight it with silver bullets technology. You just got to work with it.
Absolutely right. Well, haven't they been a fantastic panel tonight? Let's give them a big round of applause. And thank you to all of you here in Oxford for coming out tonight on a cold night to be part of this wildlife. And thank you to the hundreds and hundreds of you watching live from home. And I'm sorry we couldn't get through all the questions that were put up live tonight online, but we got through as many as we can. So thank you very much for that. I have to say, if you're live in the local area and you're not already a member of Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxford Wildlife Trust, please do join. They're a fantastic trust doing amazing work, not least working very closely with farmers in the region as well on trying to help promote and support nature-friendly farming and more resilient farming as well. So please do join Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust if you're not a member. And also do follow us on our social media channels at the Wildlife Trust. We have many more wildlives coming up this year. The next one is on February the 18th, but we've got many more planned across the year. Topics ranging from house building to nature-based solutions, to rivers, to farming, to flooding, and so much more. And also some wildlife from interesting locations over the course of this year. So make sure you're signed up on our YouTube channel and our social media feeds so that you can keep an eye on what's happening when. But other than that, thank you very much to the audience here in Oxford for joining us tonight. Thank you for joining us online. And I hope you found this a useful discussion. Thanks again to Tim, to Pete, and to Debbie. Here from Oxford, the Oxford Farming Conference and the Oxford Real Farming Conference. Thank you very much. Good night.